The county wrote nervous fever on her death certificate, but the fragments she left behind, ledgers, diaries, testimonies, tell of a child who spoke voices no one had taught her. What if her silence was not an ending, but a warning? The archives whisper when you know how to listen. That's how we begin, with dust-coated files and faded ink from a rural Ohio town that, on the surface, had nothing remarkable about it in 1867. A farming community on the edge of the Scioto River, bound by cornfields, church bells, and the endless rhythm of planting and harvest. But ask the oldest families what they remember, and the conversation shifts. Voices lower, eyes look toward the ground. They do not speak easily of the Whitlock girl. Clara was her name, and she carried a brilliance that dazzled everyone who encountered her, until that same brilliance bent into something darker, something that no one could explain. Officials in their time did not have words for what happened. They called it nervous collapse, a convenient phrase to fold away what they could not understand. The physicians wrote short notes, the schoolhouse ledger marked her as absent, and eventually the county clerk recorded her death. A simple life, ended at 12 years old, filed away among hundreds of others. But those who lived through it remembered differently. They remembered a child who spoke in languages no one taught her. They remembered the unease that grew with every word she uttered. They remembered the silence that followed, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as if something had been cut short before its time. What we have now are fragments. Letters penned by her mother, diaries by neighbors, physicians' notes tucked into medical ledgers, and scraps of testimony preserved in local newspapers. Some accounts contradict, others overlap. None of them tell the whole story, but together they create a mosaic of curiosity and dread. A girl of 11 languages who became a ghost of her former self, gone before she had even stepped into womanhood. We are not here to embellish or invent. What follows is not folklore retold by candlelight. Every word comes from surviving documents, from the handwriting of those who saw Clara Whitlock with their own eyes. It is not our task to decide whether she was possessed, blessed, cursed, or simply extraordinary in ways science could not yet measure. Our task is only to lay out the record, to show you what remains after a century and a half of silence. And so we make a pact, you and I. No dramatics, no jump scares, only the chilling weight of what is written and what is missing. We will walk together through the surviving evidence, through the voices of those who loved her, feared her, and ultimately tried to forget her. This is the story of Clara Whitlock, the girl who spoke 11 languages before losing her mind at 12. The record begins in the plainest way possible, with a line inked into the Pickaway County birth register in the spring of 1855. Whitlock, Clara, female, born to Johann Whitlock and Anne Whitlock, formerly Anne Carter. Nothing more than that. No doctor's remarks, no midwife's unusual observations. Just another farm birth in a county that recorded dozens each year, a girl born in a weathered clapboard house not far from the Scioto River. Her father, a German immigrant who had arrived a decade earlier, worked the land with steady hands and a quiet faith. Her mother, English by birth, carried the manners of a schoolteacher, though she had given up that life when she married. Together, they raised their children in the expected rhythm of the time. Early mornings, long days, hymns sung by lamplight. There was nothing in those first entries to suggest that Clara would be anything but another farm girl. Neighbors remembered the Whitlocks as private, but not unfriendly. Johann spoke heavily accented English and preferred the old language of his homeland, while Anne read her Bible in English and corrected her husband's speech when he stumbled. Clara grew up in that household of two tongues, but that was not uncommon among immigrant families. If she began speaking earlier than most, no one thought much of it. Children were clever sometimes, and cleverness was no omen in a county where survival depended more on labor than learning. The Scioto River bent not far from the Whitlock farm, its slow waters lined with sycamores and willows. That river was where the children of the county learned to skip stones, where farmers watered their horses, and where, According to one faded letter, little Clara would stand as a toddler and murmur sounds that were not quite words but carried a cadence that her mother swore sounded like prayer. Anne dismissed it at the time as childish mimicry. But the memory lingered, and when she wrote her sister in England years later, she admitted she had felt a tremor in my soul, hearing the voice of a child too young to form thoughts, yet sounding as though she carried centuries of them. No. At first, nothing separated Clara from the other children who played barefoot in the dust of the lane, chasing after chickens or gathering flowers along the hedgerow. She was pale, slight, and unremarkable in appearance, a child who could easily be overlooked in a crowded schoolhouse. The divergence came slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow stretching across the floor as the sun set. One could mark her birth plainly in ink, the house she lived in, the parents who raised her. But no one could say exactly when that house ceased to be ordinary, when that family began to hold a secret, or when a girl who began life like all the others would step off the path that history had written for her and into something altogether stranger. The first signs appeared in ways that could have been mistaken for simple cleverness, the kind of talent families boast about when company visits. By 18 months, Clara Whitlock was stringing together full sentences, not the broken babble of a toddler, but entire thoughts spoken with clarity. Her mother wrote to her sister in England that Clara asked for bread and water as neatly as if she had been taught in school, and that her father wept when she answered his greeting in his native German with flawless pronunciation. At first, this was a source of pride. Immigrant families cherished every marker that their children could straddle two worlds, the old country and the new. Johann Whitlock called it a gift, proof that his blood carried strength enough to thrive in America. But by the time she turned 3, what began as pride had curdled into something else. Clara could recite entire psalms, alternating between German and English without hesitation, as if she had been raised in 2 churches rather than one. Her parents claimed they never taught her to memorize the verses, only that she had heard them at Sunday service. Yet she spoke them aloud with perfect cadence, her voice lifting and falling like the reverend's, her tiny frame standing rigid at the table as if the words were commanding her rather than flowing from her. Neighbors described the child with affection but with a trace of nervous laughter. One farmer's wife recalled visiting for supper and being unsettled when Clara greeted her in English, then turned to her husband and addressed him in German, then whispered a few words in something neither language could explain. Anne dismissed it as child's play, but her smile was strained when she said it. Family letters preserved in the county archive reveal that even those closest to Clara felt unease. One cousin wrote of a visit where Clara sang a lullaby in Latin, a tongue no one in the household could speak. Another letter from her mother admitted she sometimes woke at night to hear her daughter murmuring in her sleep, the words too fast and unfamiliar to catch. It is as if she remembers things she has never learned, Anne confessed, her pen blotting the page with hesitation. The pride of having a gifted child lingered, but behind it grew a quiet question that no one dared voice. Did Clara learn all these things with impossible speed, or had she brought them with her from someplace beyond? The thought was unspoken, but it threaded through the family like a chill draft that could not be shut out. By the time Clara Whitlock reached 6 years of age, her presence in the county schoolhouse was no longer a curiosity, but a disturbance. The ledgers, still preserved in the archives, record her as an apt pupil with a neat hand in English and German. Yet in the margins her teacher, a Mr. Ellison, scribbled incredulous notes. One entry reads, "Child composes in French, no prior instruction." Another, written in darker ink, "Knows Latin declensions better than I." Asked where she learned, she only smiled. These fragments are all that remain, but they suggest that what the community first regarded as cleverness had grown into something unexplainable. At home, the Whitlocks owned only one book, a family Bible passed down from Anne's English relatives. It contained the Old and New Testaments in both English and German, printed on thin gilded paper that had been thumbed by generations. There were no volumes of French grammar, no Greek lexicons, nothing to account for what Clara could suddenly produce. Yet witnesses swore she recited Greek verses with fluency, copying their letters into the margins of her slate, while her classmates stumbled through their alphabet lessons. The local pastor, Reverend Matthews, left behind a sermon book where Clara's name appears twice. In the first entry, he praises her as gifted with tongues beyond her years. In the second, dated only a month later, the tone shifts. Corrected my Latin, though she should have no knowledge of it. The child grows unsettling to me. To have a 6-year-old mark errors in a sermon intended for a congregation was not only embarrassing, but, in the pastor's eyes, a sign of disorder. He preached that Sunday on the Tower of Babel, a sermon some whispered was directed at the Whitlocks more than the scripture. Neighbors, recalling her later, said Clara seemed both younger and older than her years. She still played hopscotch with the other girls, her hair in loose braids, her dress patched and simple. Yet she would pause mid-game to hum a melody in Italian, or write symbols in the dirt with a stick, symbols no one else recognized. Some children joined her, others avoided her, whispering that she had a secret friend who spoke back when no one was listening. The paradox of Clara was simple. She had no teachers, no access to books, no exposure to scholars. Yet by 6, she could read and write in 5 languages, switching between them with a casual ease that scholars from nearby towns found baffling. What they could not answer was the question whispered at kitchen tables and in the pews of the church. Was she learning, or was she remembering? By the time Clara Whitlock turned 9, the whispers around town had grown into something that could no longer be contained within family letters or the scribbled margins of school ledgers. She had moved beyond the walls of her home and the boundaries of the schoolhouse, astonishing strangers who had never heard of her before, and leaving the townsfolk with a question they could not shake. Who was teaching her? Traveling traders often passed through the Scioto River settlements, men who brought fabrics from New York, tools from Cincinnati, and stories from lands the farmers would never see. Their stops were short, their conversations practical, yet each one seemed to return with the same story. A thin farm girl with pale eyes and braids down her back had approached them and greeted them in their own tongue. A Polish tinsmith swore she spoke to him with the fluency of his own sister. An Italian peddler recounted how she asked him about Naples, inquiring after the color of the sea in words he had not heard since leaving home. A Spanish trader, baffled, claimed she conversed with him for an entire hour, describing things she could not possibly have known: festivals, songs, and prayers of his childhood village. These accounts appear in scattered records, often buried among mundane entries. The town clerk noted in 1864, Child Whitlock speaks languages unknown to this office. Traders confirm. No evidence of teachers. In the pastor's journal, one passage reads, "The girl converses with strangers in tongues we do not comprehend. A gift or a danger, time will tell." Such writings are not the kind of proof modern minds demand, but they are what remains, the surviving traces of a phenomenon that unsettled even those who tried to dismiss it. By 9 years old, Clara had crossed into territory that defied explanation. English, German, French, Latin, and Greek had already marked her as unusual, but the new languages spoken with the fluency of natives cut deeper into the community's sense of unease. Families asked each other in low voices, where could she have heard these words? Books were scarce, teachers rarer still. No one in town spoke these tongues, and yet she handled them as easily as her own breath. There are letters from her mother around this time that betray a quiet fear. She wrote that Clara no longer seemed to learn in the way other children did, no longer repeating or rehearsing. Instead, she simply began speaking, as though she were opening a door to something already inside her. Anne admitted she sometimes caught her daughter murmuring to herself in languages even she could not name, words that slid across the air like shadows. When strangers left, they carried their amazement with them. But for those who stayed in town, wonder turned slowly to dread. The question shifted from what can she say to what else might she know. For every answer Clara offered in a foreign tongue, A new silence formed behind it, pressing on the minds of those who listened. If no one had taught her, then where exactly were these words coming from? The first physician to set pen to paper about Clara Whitlock was a man named Dr. Samuel Weatherby, a graduate of the Ohio Medical College who kept an office above a general store 2 towns away. He was summoned in the winter of 1864, when Clara's reputation had begun to spread beyond the borders of her county. His case notes survive in brittle paper bound with string, the ink faded but still legible. The handwriting is precise, clinical, as though he were writing for the eyes of future scholars rather than just his own. He described Clara as a girl of 9 years, small for her age but alert, with eyes that betray uncommon intelligence. The entry continues. Patient demonstrates a faculty for languages which I cannot account for by natural means. She conversed with me in English and German, then without hesitation in French, Spanish, and Latin. Pronunciation near perfect, even in tongues she should have no access to in this region. In a later line he falters, allowing curiosity to creep into his formality. When addressed in Greek, she replied without pause, "Who has taught her?" Weatherby was careful not to invoke superstition, but his notes betray unease. He called it a supernatural linguistic faculty, though he immediately crossed out the word supernatural and replaced it with extraordinary. He suggested that Clara's brain might suffer from what he termed unhealthy overactivity, a strain produced by her ceaseless engagement with language. His recommendation was simple: rest, silence, a period away from books and conversation. He advised her parents to limit her speaking, to keep her to the rhythms of farm life, to let her be a child rather than a machine of tongues. But if the parents tried to follow his counsel, the results are not recorded. What is recorded, in her mother's diary, is that shortly after the physician's visit, Clara began to dream. Not the gentle murmurings of a child in slumber, but vivid outpourings of sound. Anne wrote that she would rise in the night to check on her daughter and find her speaking in languages no one in the house recognized. Sometimes the words came slow and solemn, like prayers. Other times they rushed out in torrents, so fast they seemed to tumble over each other, Clara's lips moving in rhythms too precise to be nonsense. A farmhand who slept in the loft overheard and later told neighbors that it was like listening to a courtroom full of voices, some high, some low, all spilling from the throat of a girl who should not have known them. When shaken awake, Clara would look around the room with confusion, unable to recall a single phrase she had spoken. Dr. Weatherby returned once more and noted, in a hand more hurried than before, "Patient speaks in sleep, languages unrecorded in my training. If this is sickness, it is not one I have read of. If it is genius that unsettles the mind of the observer." His final prescription was again rest, though his tone suggested futility. He seemed to sense, as many others did, that Clara's path could not be slowed by human hands. The clearest window into Clara's private world comes not from doctors or pastors but from the hand of her mother. Anne Whitlock kept a diary through those years, a small leather-bound book filled with steady script that becomes shakier as the months pass. In it, the ordinary is mingled with the uncanny lists of chores, notations about weather and planting, followed without warning by passages that read like confessions whispered to the page. She writes of sleepless nights, of standing in the doorway of her daughter's room, candlelight flickering across Clara's face as words poured from her lips in voices that did not belong to a child. One entry dated March 1865 notes. Clara spoke as though she were two people at once. One voice was her own, thin and high, the other low, rough, like a man's. They spoke together, layered as if two mouths shared the same breath. I could not move. I prayed until she stopped. Another entry, shorter but more chilling, reads, I heard her recite words I did not know. When I asked her what they meant, she said, "They are not yours to know, Mama." She smiled when she said it. Anne's handwriting betrays her exhaustion. Lines grow jagged, ink smeared as if written through tears. She admits to fearing sleep, not only for her child but for herself. "I dread what I will hear in the dark," she confesses. "It is worse when she dreams quietly, because then I know something stirs in her that does not need words. There are mentions of shadows moving along the walls, of a sense of being watched in her own home. Though she never accuses Clara directly, the tension lies in every line. Love for her daughter pressed against the creeping suspicion that the girl carried something no parent could reach. What makes these diary fragments compelling is their restraint. Anne was no hysteric. Her daily entries about bread baking, mending clothes, and tending the garden prove her to be a practical woman. Yet the practical gives way to dread with startling speed. On one page, she records the arrival of new chicks in the coop. On the next, she writes, "Clara asked me if chickens dream in Polish." The most haunting entry comes near the end of that summer. She sat up in bed and spoke for a long time. I cannot tell you what language it was. It was not German, not English, not any tongue I have ever heard. It made the hair rise on my neck. When I begged her to stop, she opened her eyes and said, "It is not me you should fear." After this line, the ink trails into silence, as if the pen itself faltered. In the autumn of 1865, the records from the little schoolhouse by the Scioto show a strange disruption, one that baffled teachers and unsettled the children who sat beside Clara on the rough wooden benches. For several weeks, she refused to speak a single word of English. The teacher, Mr. Ellison, at first assumed she was being willful, perhaps testing authority, but soon he realized that she was speaking constantly, fluently in a language he did not know and could not place. In the attendance ledger for that month, his usual notations about tardiness and spelling lessons gave way to a frustrated scrawl. "Foreign gibberish, cannot correct her work, refuses English." Years later, when former classmates were interviewed for county histories, their memories converged on those weeks with unease. One girl, then a child of 7, said she remembered Clara turning to her during arithmetic and whispering in a stream of words like rushing water. Another boy swore that whatever she said made the hairs on his arm rise, though he could not recall a single sound of it by the time he told the story as an old man. They agreed on one point: the language was not nonsense. It had structure, rhythm, and repetition. It was the way she spoke it with confidence, without pause, that marked it as something more than childish play. The children, of course, carried their stories home. Parents complained, and whispers began to move through the town. What child forgets her own tongue, only to adopt another that no one can identify? Some blamed the Whitlocks for spoiling her, allowing her to dabble in books from elsewhere, but others knew better. There were no such books in that house. The only volumes were the family Bible and a handful of almanacs. Clara was not reading, she was channeling. Anne's diary confirms the teacher's frustration. She wrote that Clara came home from school each afternoon flushed and indignant, insisting she had done her lessons correctly, that it was Mr. Ellison who could not understand. When Anne begged her to speak in German or English at home, Clara would comply for a moment, then slip back into the strange tongue without seeming to notice. At night, she scrawled symbols on her slate curves and angles that no one recognized before erasing them quickly if anyone entered the room. For the children who sat beside her, those weeks left a mark that never faded. Testimonies decades later still carried the tremor of that memory. A classmate not yet 10 years old who abandoned the shared language of her peers, replacing it with something older, heavier, and beyond them all. It was as though, for a time, Clara belonged to another world entirely, and only she knew its words. The townspeople, unsettled by weeks of hearing stories about Clara's strange speech in the schoolhouse, eventually pressed the matter upon the church. In rural Ohio, questions of the unexplained were rarely left to doctors or teachers alone. Sooner or later, the pulpit was asked to pass judgment. That task fell to Reverend Josiah Harlan, a stern man with a hawk's gaze and a voice that could make even the strongest farmer shrink in his pew. He had heard the whispers, but until the autumn of 1865, he had not witnessed Clara himself. When the girl's refusal to speak English persisted, and the teacher confessed he could not manage her, Harlan announced he would test the child's tongue against the language of the ancients. It was a Wednesday afternoon when he arrived at the schoolhouse, accompanied by 2 deacons and half a dozen curious parents. The children sat stiff at their benches, their slates forgotten, as the Reverend fixed Clara with a cold stare. He opened a worn notebook filled with verses few in that county would have recognized. They were fragments of Aramaic scripture he had copied during his time at seminary, passages he himself had struggled to master. To the watchers, this was no simple exercise. It was a trial, a weighing of the girl's gift or curse. Harlan spoke the words slowly, carefully, his pronunciation labored but correct. Clara listened without blinking, her head tilted slightly as though she were hearing a familiar melody. When he finished, she responded not in the uncertain mimicry of a child, but with fluency that rolled from her tongue like water. Then, as if that were not enough, she repeated one of his phrases and corrected his intonation, adjusting the guttural consonant he had softened. Those present would later swear they felt the air in the room shift, as though the weight of the words pressed against their skin. The Reverend flushed red, his hand trembling as he closed the notebook. Some claimed his eyes blazed with anger, others with fear. Clara, unbothered, returned to her slate, sketching the same unreadable marks she had been making for weeks. Silence held the room until Harlan barked for dismissal. The children fled into the yard, their whispers carrying on the wind. That Sunday, the Reverend mounted the pulpit with a thunderous expression. His sermon was drawn from Corinthians, but his words carried an edge that every parishioner recognized. "The devil speaks in many voices," he declared, his fist striking the Bible. "And he comes not as a stranger, but as one who walks among us." He never named Clara directly, but no one in the church mistook his meaning. Mothers drew their children closer. Fathers stared grimly at the floor, and the Whitlocks, seated in the rear pew, carried the weight of every eye in the room. Among the fragments that survive from the Whitlock household, one of the most perplexing is a slim ledger kept by Clara's father. Johann Whitlock was not a man of letters by training, but he was meticulous. He recorded the yield of each season, the weight of calves at birth, the cost of flour in Chillicothe. Alongside these practical accounts, he began another record, a careful catalogue of his daughter's languages. The first entries are simple, almost proud. Age 3. Recites psalm in German and English. Age 5. Writes letters in Latin. Age 6. Speaks French to itinerant trader. Understood. Each new line seemed to mark not just Clara's progress, but her father's attempt to contain the uncontainable, to reduce the strange unfolding of her gift into numbers and dates. As the years pass in the ledger, the entries grow denser. By age 7 there are columns, one for the language, another for the witness, a third for notes about fluency. Johann lists men from town, travelers, even a visiting physician, as though summoning outsiders to confirm what he could scarcely believe himself. Age 8. Italian Signor Bianchi, peddler, testifies. Age 9. Spanish heard by Reverend's wife, correct pronunciation. It is as if the ledger became his defense, proof against accusations that his child was touched by madness or worse. The tone of pride, however, fades into something darker. The handwriting trembles. Words like unsettling and disturbing appear in the margins. By the time Clara is 10, the neat record resembles less a catalogue of progress than a chronicle of dread. And then there is the mystery. The ledger, which now rests in the county archive, ends abruptly. After the entry noting her 9th birthday and her conversations with a Spanish trader, there is a gap. The next intact page is dated 2 years later, recording nothing more than Clara's illness and confinement. The final 30 pages, scholars note, have been violently removed. The stubs of torn paper cling to the spine, jagged, deliberate. Whoever did it wanted those entries gone, but not the book itself. Who removed them? Some suggest Johann himself, ashamed of what his careful record had revealed. Others whisper it was the Reverend, determined to erase evidence that might contradict his sermons. A few point to Anne, whose diary shows both love and terror, and who may have sought to bury her daughter's darkest utterances. Without the missing pages, the truth is unreachable. What remains is absence, which in many ways speaks louder than ink. Researchers today call it the silence of the ledger. What did Clara say in those final entries? Which languages appeared that compelled someone to tear them out rather than let them stand? The book that was meant to anchor her strangeness has instead become its most haunting relic, a testimony to both what we know and what someone, for reasons lost to time, could not allow us to know. The Whitlock farm, once just another weathered homestead along the Scioto, began to draw attention from far beyond the county line. What had been a local curiosity, passed around in murmurs after church and at market, began to attract strangers who arrived with questions and notebooks. The earliest were physicians from nearby towns, men with spectacles and heavy medical tomes, who claimed they had heard of a child who spoke in tongues no classroom had offered. They came politely enough, asking permission to test her. Johann, proud still in those days, allowed it. Letters preserved in a cousin's attic described these visits. Clara seated at the kitchen table, her hands folded neatly, answering question after question in languages the visitors half recognized. Soon the visitors grew more distinguished. A linguist from Cincinnati arrived in 1866, bringing with him scraps of Greek poetry and a volume of Sanskrit. He left within 2 days, pale and shaken, refusing supper and boarding the stagecoach without farewell. A priest from New York followed, insisting that only the church could determine the source of her gift. He spent 3 evenings in the Whitlock parlor with Clara before departing abruptly, muttering prayers under his breath as though something he had heard had lodged too deeply to be shaken off. Neighbors noticed the carriages at odd hours, men with city coats and fine boots trudging up the dirt lane, their faces eager when they arrived and drawn when they departed. Few spoke to the townsfolk about what they had witnessed inside the Whitlock house, but one doctor, looser with his tongue than the rest, told the innkeeper that the girl had spoken to him in a language he recognized from ancient manuscripts. Not just spoken, he corrected himself. She taught me what I had learned incorrectly. He would not elaborate further, and when pressed, he only shook his head. The letters of Anne Whitlock during this period shift in tone. At first, she notes with some pride that gentlemen of learning found their way to her door. But soon her entries darken. She writes of how Clara seemed to anticipate the visitors, greeting them in their own languages before they could introduce themselves. She wrote of her daughter's faint smile when they paled, as if Clara were aware of the power she held over them. Not all visitors stayed long enough to make notes. Some fled before nightfall, refusing beds offered to them. One was overheard saying, "It is not the child I fear, but what listens when she speaks." Their words trailed off into silence, leaving only speculation. What did they hear that made men of science and scripture alike abandon their inquiries? The surviving letters cannot answer, only circle around the absence. What is certain is that the Whitlock farm ceased to be just a home. It had become, for a brief and uneasy time, a threshold that strangers crossed hoping to learn something, only to leave with less certainty than when they arrived. By the spring of 1866, Clara had turned 11, and the strangeness that had once been confined to her voice began to press outward into the physical world. The Whitlock home, built of rough-hewn timbers and sitting on a stone foundation, had a low cellar that smelled of earth and limestone. It was used for storing preserves, potatoes, and the few jars of cider Johann managed each autumn. For years it had been a mundane space, cool and unremarkable. That changed when Anne descended one morning and found Clara crouched against the wall, her small fingers stained with white dust. She was scratching into the limestone with a shard of broken crockery, lines and curves that shimmered faintly in the lantern light. The symbols were not letters, not the kind found in books or Bibles. They bent at odd angles, spirals folding into shapes that unsettled the eye, as though they had been copied from some language not meant for human mouths. Anne demanded to know what she was doing, but Clara only pressed her lips together and continued carving. Johann was summoned, his temper sharper than his wife's. He grabbed a bucket and brush, determined to scrub away the markings before they stained the stone deeper. Yet, when he pressed the bristles against the wall, Clara's voice cut through the cellar, low and calm, utterly unlike a child's. "They are not for you." Johann dropped the brush. Anne later wrote in her diary that his face went pale, as if he had been addressed not by his daughter but by someone standing behind her. Still, he tried again, scouring harder until the marks blurred under water and soap. But the next morning, fresh symbols appeared, drawn higher up, as though the child had stood on tiptoe in the night to reach them. Neighbors who later heard the tale dismissed it as fancy, but the cellar walls remained a point of unease. Visitors who were offered jars of preserves remarked on the pale scratches just visible beneath the shelves. One local mason who examined them shook his head and said it was no script he knew, not Latin, not Greek, not any language he had seen etched into church stones. "Looks more like maps of places I wouldn't want to go," he muttered. Clara never explained the carvings. When asked, she would only smile faintly or fall into silence. Yet once, when her sister Mary begged her to stop, Clara touched one of the symbols and whispered, "They tell me things." What things? No one ever discovered. The cellar grew colder in those months, or so Anne swore, as if the house itself strained under words that had been pressed into its stones. And from that time forward, the family ceased to use the cellar unless absolutely necessary. The walls, marked with a language unrecognized, seemed to belong to someone other than them. It was a Sunday in late summer when the Whitlocks took their usual place in the rear pew of the small clapboard church by the Scioto. The service had begun without incident, the Reverend reading steadily from Corinthians while the congregation fanned themselves against the heat. Nothing marked the morning as different until Clara, then only 11, rose from her seat. Witnesses remembered the sound of the wooden bench scraping as she stood, her small frame casting a thin shadow against the sunlight pouring through the tall windows. Without prompting, she walked down the aisle to the front, her bare feet silent against the floorboards. The Reverend faltered mid-verse, unsure whether to scold or indulge her. Before he could decide, Clara began to speak. At first, some thought it was another display of Latin, the kind she had offered before that had already unsettled the schoolhouse. But soon those with sharper ears realized it was neither Latin nor Greek. She was delivering words in Hebrew, flawless and resonant, shaping the syllables with the precision of someone who had studied the Torah for years. Yet, no Torah existed in that town. No one had taught her the tongue. Gasps rippled through the pews. Men who had fought in the Mexican War gripped their knees. Women clutched their children closer. The Reverend, his mouth half open, dropped his Bible onto the pulpit, the sound cracking like a gunshot in the tense room. Clara's voice did not waver. She delivered not fragments or prayers, but a sermon cohesive, rhythmic, a message about covenant and judgment that echoed against the rafters. An older farmer, who years later retold the event, swore that her cadence mirrored that of rabbis he had once heard in Cincinnati. When Clara fell silent, the hush was absolute. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the panic broke. Some wept openly, declaring she was chosen, a prophet sent to awaken them. Others shouted the opposite, that no child should carry such words, that she was cursed, an instrument of deception. The Reverend himself, pale with sweat, declared the devil could dress his lies in holy syllables. His booming voice cut through the confusion. The devil speaks in many voices. The congregation splintered. Families left in fear, some refusing ever to return while Clara's shadow lingered in memory. For weeks afterward, the church sat half empty, its pews filled only with those determined to believe she was a vessel of God. But for others, the building had become tainted. haunted by the memory of a child standing where no child belonged, speaking in a tongue she could never have learned. What she said was remembered less than the way she said it, calm, sure, as though she were not preaching to the congregation, but relaying a message meant for ears far older, far darker than theirs. The testimony of those who remembered Clara often differed in detail, but on one point a curious number agreed. Her eyes did not remain constant. The most vivid account comes from an aging midwife, Martha Ellison, who was interviewed nearly 40 years after Clara's death. She had delivered half the children in that county and claimed to have seen enough to know the difference between truth and fancies. Yet when asked about Clara, her voice wavered. She insisted the girl's eyes shifted with her speech, as if each language brought with it a new shade. Martha described it plainly. When Clara spoke German, her eyes were the pale blue of her father's, clear as river water. When she slipped into French, they deepened to green, a shade that seemed to catch light where none was. And when she used the unknown tongue, the one no one could name, her eyes blackened entirely, the pupils drowning the color until it was as though one stared into wells with no bottom. Martha admitted she had tried not to look when that happened, for the effect made her hands tremble. At first, scholars dismissed her claim as the invention of memory warped by time. But her account does not stand alone. At least 3 other testimonies collected in local histories make similar remarks. A farmer's wife, recalling Clara speaking to a Spanish trader, said, "Her eyes turned like polished green stones, and I thought of serpents." A schoolmate remembered that during the weeks Clara refused English, her eyes looked dark, darker than a child's ought to be, as if the black of the board had slipped into them. Even Clara's mother, in a rare confession, wrote in her diary, "Her eyes betray her. Sometimes she is my daughter. Sometimes she is not." The strangeness of the eyes became another layer of unease, one that deepened the rift between those who called her gifted and those who whispered of curses. Neighbors avoided direct gazes, claiming they felt dizzy, unsettled, as though the child were not merely looking but peering through them. Children teased her for it until she turned her gaze upon them, and then they fell silent, unsure of what they had seen. What makes these testimonies compelling is their consistency across decades. People who did not know each other, speaking years apart, described the same phenomena: blue for German, green for French, black for the language that defied names. Whether it was a trick of light, a condition of the eyes, or something more, none could say. What they could say is that no one who looked too long at Clara Whitlock ever forgot the feeling, as though the colors of her gaze belonged not to her, but to the voices that moved through her. The testimony of Mary Whitlock, Clara's younger sister, is perhaps the most unsettling of all the accounts that survive. For it comes not from a neighbor or passing visitor, but from someone who lived under the same roof, who shared her meals and her games, and who knew firsthand what it meant when Clara's gift began to devour the familiar. Mary was only 8 when her older sister turned unrecognizable. Decades later, when she was a grandmother herself, she confided to an interviewer that the house had felt less like a home and more like a place haunted by a presence that wore Clara's face but no longer belonged to her. Mary said it began quietly, with small slips in recognition. Clara would call her father by another name entirely, Alaric or Tomas, spoken in accents Mary had never heard. At first, the family laughed, assuming Clara was playing. But the names grew stranger, weighted with syllables that felt ancient, and her voice carried tones that did not sound like her own. "It wasn't pretending," Mary said, her eyes downcast as she recalled the memory. "She looked at me and spoke as if I were someone dead, someone she remembered, but not as her sister." The diary of their mother confirms parts of this, noting with a trembling hand that Clara sometimes addressed Anne as Marta or Elisheva, names that had no place in the Whitlock family tree. Worse still, she would not respond when called Clara, as if the name itself had ceased to mean her. Mary remembered crying in frustration, tugging at her sister's sleeve, begging her to stop. "She stared through me," she told the interviewer. and for a moment I thought maybe she did not know me at all, as if she was looking at a shadow of someone else standing where I was. It was not only the names. Clara's accents shifted as fluidly as her languages, sometimes thick and guttural, other times sharp and clipped, tones that carried weight far older than the child who spoke them. When she addressed Mary in these voices, Mary said, it felt as though the house itself leaned closer to listen. Their father scolded, their mother wept, but nothing changed. Clara could not or would not return to the names she had once used, and in time the family grew silent under the strain. Mary carried the memory all her life, never quite shaking the image of her sister's eyes turning dark as she spoke words that no one in their family understood. What haunted her most was not fear of curses or devils, but the quiet grief of losing someone who still stood beside her, breathing, speaking, yet already gone. By the time Clara reached her 12th year, the house on the Scioto had grown quiet in ways that frightened even those who had once defended her. For years she had filled its rooms with the murmur of tongues, a river of voices flowing through her mouth, sometimes familiar, sometimes strange, always unsettling. Then, without warning, the voices ceased. One morning, Anne found her eldest daughter seated by the window, hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on a patch of sky that shifted from gray to pale blue as the hours passed. She did not answer when spoken to. She did not move when touched. Days went by, and still she sat in silence, as though something inside her had gone dormant or withdrawn beyond reach. The family at first rejoiced quietly, hoping perhaps the long silence meant the ordeal was over, that Clara had grown out of the strange affliction. Yet it soon became clear that this was no return to normalcy. She did not laugh. She did not eat unless food was placed directly into her hands. She did not look at her parents or her sister. It was as though Clara Whitlock, the girl they had known, had drained away, leaving only a body that breathed and blinked. After nearly a week of this vacancy, the silence broke, but not in the way they had hoped. Clara's lips began to move, shaping words that spilled into the air in a cadence neither German nor English nor anything anyone in the household could identify. The phrase was short, only 4 or 5 words, but she repeated it endlessly, her voice flat, almost mechanical, her eyes still fixed on something beyond the window. Neighbors were called in to listen. Some thought it might be Slavic, others said it resembled no tongue they had heard even in the markets of Cincinnati. A priest summoned from town left quickly after hearing it, refusing to speculate, muttering only that the sound of it clung to him long after he had left the house. She spoke that phrase for hours at a time, pausing only to sleep, then resuming upon waking as though no interval had passed. Mary, her younger sister, remembered lying awake at night in the bed they shared, listening to the steady repetition, each syllable hammering against the darkness until she covered her ears. Anne's diary records her despair. Better she had never spoken at all than this endless chant. It eats at the walls. It eats at my mind. The phrase itself has been lost. No one wrote it down faithfully, perhaps because no one dared to. Only fragments remain. Half-remembered sounds written phonetically in shaky hands, none of them agreeing with the others. What survives is not the phrase itself, but the memory of its effect. Those who heard it spoke of unease, of feeling watched, of a chill that lingered in the room long after Clara had fallen silent again. Whatever those words were, they belonged to no language the living could claim, and at 12 years old, they became the only words Clara would give the world. When word spread that Clara had fallen into silence, broken only by the endless repetition of a phrase no one could identify, her parents sent once more for Dr. Samuel Weatherby. The physician had seen her 3 years before, when she was still a prodigy of languages rather than a mystery steeped in dread. He arrived at the Whitlock home in the spring of 1867, his black coat powdered with dust from the long carriage ride, his medical bag clutched as if its contents might ward off what he was about to witness. Neighbors later recalled his grim expression as he crossed the threshold, already aware he was stepping into a place haunted not by spirits but by something less definable. Weatherby examined Clara in her chair by the window. She did not flinch when he lifted her wrist to check her pulse. She did not blink when he shone a lantern briefly toward her eyes. Her body was alive and healthy, her skin warm, her heart steady, but her gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the wall of the farmhouse. When he asked her name, she did not respond. When he spoke in English, German, and even Latin, she ignored him. Only after a long silence did her lips move, shaping again the strange phrase she had muttered for weeks. He asked her to repeat it, to slow it down, to translate. She answered only with the same unchanging rhythm, her voice drained of inflection. The doctor took notes quickly, his hand cramped from the pace. In one passage he observed, "Patient seems intact of body but withdrawn from her surroundings. Language faculty remains, but not directed outward. Speaks phrase without comprehension, as though reciting lines heard in a dream." He lingered for hours, questioning the family, studying the girl, waiting for any sign that her mind might flicker back to ordinary life. It never came. Instead, he admitted in his final entry something more unsettling than before. "If the mind is a house," he wrote, "hers contains rooms not built for human habitation. I can peer through the windows but do not recognize what lives there." He advised once more that she be kept from overstimulation, though he confessed privately to Johann that no prescription he knew could cure what was unfolding. One neighbor claimed to have overheard him say as he packed his bag, "She is speaking to someone, but not to us." With that, he departed, leaving the Whitlocks to their vigil. The phrase continued, day and night, eroding the family's strength. Weatherby's notes survive, brittle and brown with age, their words heavy with a physician's attempt at control, even as he admitted defeat. His metaphor of the house has endured in the retellings, an image that captures the chilling truth. Clara's mind had become an architecture, none of them were meant to enter, and what dwelled there had no intention of leaving. The final official traces of Clara Whitlock's life come not from her family or the county, but from the yellowing files of a sanitarium near Columbus, where she was admitted in the summer of 1867. The building was a gray, sprawling institution on the edge of the city, designed to house those whose conditions could not be explained or managed at home. For the Whitlocks, sending Clara there was a decision made with reluctance, but by then her endless chanting and vacant stares had hollowed the household. The neighbors whispered of curses, the church kept its distance, and her parents, weary with sleepless nights, yielded to the suggestion that specialists might succeed where they had failed. The admission ledger describes her as female, age 12, presenting with linguistic disturbances and episodes of catatonia. The attending physician noted her startling capacity for tongues and listed 11 distinct languages recorded during her first weeks in residence. These included the expected English, German, French, Latin, Greek, but also tongues less common in Ohio: Italian, Spanish, Polish, Hebrew, and two that the staff could not identify. The reports describe nurses standing transfixed as she shifted from one to another, her voice steady, her grammar precise. One orderly, himself the son of immigrants, insisted that her Polish was, without fault, like a native. Another doctor swore she corrected his Hebrew pronunciation. But just as quickly as the flood came, it ebbed. By the winter of that year, her speech began to dwindle. Notes from December describe her sitting motionless for hours, refusing food until coaxed, her lips moving only to repeat a single phrase in a language none of the staff could place. The words were transcribed phonetically in the files, but scholars who examined them later found no match in any known tongue. One nurse, writing privately in her journal, admitted that the sound of it left her uneasy, as though it belonged to someone far older than the child who spoke it. On her 13th birthday, the entries shift abruptly. The physicians record that Clara ceased speaking altogether. She sat in silence through examinations, her gaze vacant, her hands folded in her lap. Staff attempted to provoke responses with familiar languages, prayers, even music, but she remained mute. Her last words are preserved only in the scribbled margin of a doctor's note. She whispered once in the early morning, then never again. The sanitarium kept her until her death the following year. No improvement was ever noted, no recovery recorded. The silence that began after her 13th birthday endured until the end, sealing her story as both extraordinary and tragic. The hospital records remain clinical, detached, yet between the lines a grim truth emerges. Whatever force had spoken through Clara Whitlock had withdrawn, leaving behind only a hollow stillness that no medicine could touch. The official record of Clara Whitlock's end is stark in its brevity. In the sanitarium ledger for March of 1868, a single line stands. Whitlock Clara, female, age 13, deceased, cause, nervous fever, nothing more. The words are bureaucratic, drained of all that had made her a source of awe and terror in equal measure. To the state of Ohio, she was simply another patient, lost to an affliction the doctors could neither define nor cure. The burial record at the county office echoes the same. Her name, her age, the place of interment in a small plot attached to the sanitarium grounds. It notes no family present. Whether the Whitlocks were too impoverished to make the journey, or too weary to face the truth, no one can say. Yet alongside this sterile documentation lies a fragment that refuses to vanish. In the box of loose files from that year, historians found an unsigned note, written in a hurried hand on cheap paper. It is not part of the official report but folded between two sheets of patient logs, as though hidden by someone uncertain whether to destroy it or preserve it. The note reads, "At the hour of her passing, she whispered one last word. I will not write it. It was not of any tongue I know, and yet it pressed upon my heart with weight I cannot explain. Let this be enough. She did not die in silence." That small confession transforms the narrative. Officially, Clara's decline had left her mute for months, a child emptied of voice and thought. But if the nurse's note is true, she broke her silence only once more, uttering a word too disturbing to be recorded. Scholars have debated endlessly, was it fear that stayed the nurse's hand, or reverence? Did she refuse because the sound of it suggested something unholy, or because it carried meaning that was not meant to be shared? The absence of the word itself has become its own haunting presence. Families who once lived near the Whitlocks claimed that silence was a mercy, that to write it down would be to give it breath again. Others insist that whatever Clara carried with her, she took to the grave, leaving behind only shadows. Her death certificate remains in the county archive, a relic of a life reduced to statistics. But the unsigned note lingers like a whisper through the years, reminding us that her story does not end neatly. She was 13 years old, buried under the Ohio soil, yet the last sound she made refuses to be contained by ink. Even in death, Clara Whitlock left the living with a question they could not answer, and perhaps were never meant to. The story of Clara Whitlock does not survive as a whole but as a scattering of fragments, each one fragile, each one incomplete. In the county archive, there is the school ledger where her teacher scrawled in exasperation, calling her words foreign gibberish. There are the case notes of Dr. P.'s Ivdashin, Samuel Weatherby, their ink faded but still carrying his admission that her mind was a house with rooms not built for human habitation. There is the father's ledger, its final 30 pages torn away, the violence of the removal almost as telling as the entries that remain. And there is the mother's diary, its pages trembling with fear and devotion, confessing that she heard her daughter speak with voices not her own. Individually, these documents might be dismissed as curiosities, the eccentricities of memory and grief. Together, they form a pattern too consistent to ignore. A child who spoke in languages no one taught her, who addressed strangers in their native tongues, who etched symbols into stone that no mason could recognize. A child who delivered a sermon in flawless Hebrew without ever laying eyes on a Torah. A child whose eyes shifted color with the cadence of her words until blackness consumed them in the presence of the unknown. The sanitarium records add their own clinical layer, listing the 11 languages she commanded before her silence fell, and the terse line of her death certificate. Nervous fever. Yet even there the human element leaks through in the unsigned note, the one that insists she did not leave the world without speaking one last word, a word too heavy, too unsettling, for the nurse to record. That silence, that refusal, may be the most eloquent testimony of all. What remains, then, is not certainty but unease. Clara Whitlock was not merely gifted, not a prodigy in the way history celebrates. Prodigies dazzle, but they remain tethered to the world we know. Clara spoke as though tethered elsewhere, her voice drawing from wells that no one in Ohio or perhaps anywhere had a map for. Her life ended at 13, yet the fragments of her existence still disturb the dust of the archive, pulling the imagination toward questions that paper cannot answer. Some children are prodigies, some are prophets, and some, like Clara Whitlock, speak voices the world was never meant to hear. The records close, but the echo lingers, faint as a breath against the ear, leaving us to wonder whether her silence was an end or merely the pause between words not meant for the living.